Yep, great.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, back to the Regeneration Podcast. I'm Michael Martin, your co-host with Michael Sauter. How are you doing,
Excuse
Mike?
me, I'm horsing. It's rude of me, but I was famished.
Mike's eating in front of the public.
Yeah, but I was mentioning before, and it's rude to eat and talk. But I was mentioning for a moment ago, Michael, that we had some potatoes, and then our neighbor's doing some kind of cold smoking thing. And my wife said he threw over some of this meat of some kind and with just some potatoes with a little bit of olive oil.
Oh yeah,
So delicious, so delicious.
sounds good. Well,
Yeah.
this is actually, you want to
You
guess?
make more beverages. They
I
should
do.
they should lock you in a room with like just strange things and you turn it into a beverage. You know,
This is actually Perry, or it's like pear wine. It's
one of
like,
the three fruits that naturally ferments, right? Grapes, apples, and pears are the only ones
yeah,
that
and
left unaided will turn into booze.
it's going to be, well, not this glass, but it's going to be brandy in a couple days.
Yeah.
Um,
You know, that comes into Eucharistic theology. People argue like in different cultures, did it have to
Brandy.
be wine? Yeah. Did it have to be wine? Could it be sake? And then some people have staked a middle ground saying inherent to the symbolism is this idea that it would naturally increase. And so then the idea could you use apple cider, like fed the original colonies here for a long time, which ferments,
Uh-huh.
and pears, they would be the two other ones that in this mid ground of theology would say indigenous versions of those could be a
Oh,
substitute.
really?
Yeah.
That's interesting.
Yep. Yep.
That is it.
Jacob Neusner, not an unfamous guy, great scholar of Judaism and religion, just a towering intellect. I think he wrote that
But
in an article in Chronicles magazine.
yeah, I wonder if you could use mead.
Honey,
Though it's
does it
not.
naturally ferment?
Yes.
I think that mead, welcome.
I mean, I don't naturally ferment it, but you can naturally ferment
Yeah,
it.
a
Um,
land
and,
flowing with milk and mead.
well, that's the thing. I mean, I don't know if you know this, Mike.
Tell me.
I didn't know this either, but according to some things I've read by, legit theologians, not just some whack job. Um,
I'm a whack job. If there's those two
well,
categories, I'm
well,
definitely a
no, I
whack
mean,
job.
and they said that some of the early Christian liturgies were not only uh, did not only use the Eucharistic elements of bread and wine, but they also used milk and honey.
I've heard it say that like some of the poetry of milk and honey is milk captures infancy and honey would be the second childhood of old age. I've
Well,
always
and
kind
they
of
may
liked
have,
that. Yeah.
and
There's some, I
I,
mean, all
I,
these things are very poetic, is what I
I
want to say.
don't remember, but I think one of them had to do with the rites of initiation.
Huh.
So I'm not sure, but it's kind of interesting because as we know,
Mithraism used a lot of honey in rites of initiation. I know that from the novel Porreus, John Cowper
I didn't
Powell's.
know that, but that makes sense. Well, it makes sense because I've been writing a lot about. Well, I wrote a Substack about mead and Dionysus the other day.
Okay.
Um,
I've got to catch up on your
because
Substacks.
me
I'm like
too.
six behind,
Yeah, I'm wait, yeah, whatever. But
but in a
anyway,
different way.
yes, it's kind of interesting. And of course, as I was telling you before we went live, today was our last day of the CSA for this season.
Yeah. And you didn't have
And
everything I wanted if you had, but you had a lot of other cool
well,
things.
and what's the thing is, what I was just doing before I came in, I picked, I don't know, a bushel full of onions
That's cool.
because it looks like usually sometimes, if our onions don't do that super well, we don't have enough to last through the winter. We get more than enough to last through winter. So
Wow.
we will be having French onion
It
soup
gives me the
on the
shivers,
horizon.
like we're going to get nuclear war and you're going to be the last guy living because you've
That's
got some
right.
onions in
I
your
got
basement.
brandy, mead, and onions.
Who knows what Netanyahu's going to do on Iran? Oh,
Oh,
gosh. Save us, Lord. Well,
now
our guest, are we him in?
I was just about to weave, man.
Yeah, I want to see.
So yes, so today our guest, Stephane, is that how you pronounce it, Stephane?
That's perfect. Yeah.
Stephane Gaulin Brown, who I first encountered. I can't even remember which issue of Jesus' the Imagination was. Who
I'm not sure
contributed?
myself. I have it on the shelf behind me
You
Yeah,
said it's a
somewhere.
back cover artistry piece?
that's right.
Huh.
Let
What
me
was
look.
that?
I'm not going to look for it now. It'll
Well,
drive
what
me.
did you draw it of? And I can guess the theme of the issue.
It was the Divine Feminine, I think.
Oh, okay. So yeah.
Um,
That's how I met Therese Schroeder Schuckert.
Chic.
Schicker.
Check it.
Schicker. Sorry,
So,
Therese.
well, anyways, Stephane comes to us from Montreal area.
That's right. Yep.
Yeah, which I love that. I mean, I haven't been there for 15 years probably, but I do love Quebec and do love Montreal in particular. The only problem with Montreal is that, my French is really wonky, but when I try to use French there, people figure out, nope, he's an Anglo. They switch right to English. They don't want to wait around.
They
But
give you the bonjour.
welcome to the Regeneration Podcast. And as part of that, why don't you introduce your background and your work to us?
And say how you found us too. You said you had heard the podcast, and I wonder, Michael and I have done this for a while now, but I really haven't been able to think about, because I can't wrap my head around quite clearly how people find us.
Yeah, and with the internet, I mean, sometimes it's hard to remember how you found things anyways.
Yeah, right. Yeah, no, well said.
But I think I was getting into meditations on the tarot. And then I think I'd done some Google search and I found Michael Martin on another podcast with a guy named Jacob Given. And I listened to that episode and I was like, oh, this is very intriguing. So I bought the book, is it Divine Sophia? This is, I think, 2018 now. And he had like a kind of like a reading group reading the Meditations on the Tarot, that podcast. Anyways, and from there, I found out about Michael Martin's work and then was following it for a while and then found the podcast, pretty much when it started.
Yeah.
Yeah, but I live in Montreal. I'm originally from Vancouver Island, from British Columbia.
Oh, really? Other side of the country.
Other side of the country, that's right. And I have a bit of a Quebecois, well, I have a Quebecois connection. My father is Quebecois. And I've been out here about 8 years now. And that's it. I work in architecture and I've had a bit of a journey trying to figure out, how do I understand architecture? Because it's not always evident in terms of what is taught and how things are run. And but that's one of the reasons why I've kind of harmonized and synchronized with kind of the work you guys are doing. The role of the imagination. Blake is a big influence for me. Yeah.
I was going to ask you, like, when you were reading Michael's works, I think you got to it with Blake and things. What was the hanger or the scaffold upon which you constellated these things that were interesting to you? Would you have used the word sophiology? Would you have used the word Blake-related imagination things?
Yeah, I mean, I think my fascination has been with the imagination and how the imagination participates in perception. Like Blake would say, I see through the eye instead of with the eye. And that's really
that already makes you a good architect.
Well, I mean, it puts you on the right path, I guess.
Yeah.
There's a lot of things.
Yeah, you're in the game.
In the game.
Anything outside that game is nothing. Yeah.
Yes, and of course, I think of Blake's, risey young artists, and includes architects in that list. And so yeah, that's basically been my journey. It's been a winding one. I was raised by kind of back to the earth hippies on Vancouver Island, and my dad grew most of the food we ate.
Great.
And that kind of grounded me as I kind of headed off to university and kind of encountered all the insanity.
Was there any downsides to your upbringing, though? And you don't have to answer that. How would you describe them? And don't say anything you're not comfortable saying. Because it could sound idyllic. You're aware of that. For some people, they say the whole thing was just what we're trying to recreate. You could make a lot of money on Twitter.
Yeah, no, there's definitely a downside. I mean, there's the dark side of the kind of hippie movement that I think I definitely encountered, the kind of drugs and rock and roll that has a kind of, a wake of destruction behind it. So that's definitely something that I grew up with as well. I remember from childhood reading some Archie comic, and it was like, somebody was like, they had very straight parents and they were hippies, and there was some comic where there was some guy who had very hippie parents and he was very straight with a collared shirt and stuff like that. So I had a bit of that compunction when I was younger, which I had to temper.
Completely normal. Yeah.
Yes, a little later on. Yes, but it kind of did immunize me a bit from some of the insanity, of course, going to university.
Yeah.
It was funny because the total insanity that really happened after 2016, at least from my perspective,
Yeah.
it really felt like kind of going through the university system. It was like a kind of Indiana Jones kind of situation where things seem to be crumbling behind you as you kind of race
Oh
out
yeah,
of
no
this.
kidding. Yeah.
So it was, um,
That's a
and
great analogy.
just kind of making it through on the, just as, and definitely things were falling and hitting me as I was kind of clamoring to get
Oh,
out of
it's
there.
yeah, it is not.
I don't know what it is up as closely as you guys. Yeah.
Oh man, no, I don't really want to talk about it. But well, no, because it's well, I think we've been saying it for a while there, right, Mike? I
Well,
mean, what
yeah,
we've watched happen over the last 5, 6, 7 years
Sure.
is,
yeah,
well, now it's out in the open. Now it's undeniable, but I think we were in denial before that all these institutions have just crumbled before our eyes,
yeah,
right? Government, education, the church, they just
Medicine.
kind of like, wow. You know what I mean? They just, we get to the point where you can
It
no longer
doesn't make you
deny.
super welcome at parties because I don't lead with that, but it's so much part of my worldview, and I work for the Catholic Church and I talk about the deaths of the church, but at least the church dies and resurrects. But,
yeah,
we've lost our connections to our churches and hospitals. So all these institutions are dying. And people are like, wow, wow, wow,
Well,
but I don't say it with passion or I don't need to convince anybody.
our local hospital here
Mhm.
was part of the St. Joseph's Mercy Hospital. Now they took St. Joseph off it and they just call it Chelsea Hospital, which
Yeah.
makes me sick to my stomach. But that's the sic transit mundi. That this goes the world, right?
Yeah.
did you guys
Um,
uh, did you guys notice it kind of happen kind of very rapidly at a certain point? Because I feel like maybe I was in my early 20s. I did not have a perception on this, and then it almost just seemed like it was just
It's been a question
overnight.
for me. If you've
well,
heard the podcast, like with that Adam Smith, he was a guy that during the pandemic,
that's what
he
happened.
had no idea. He had no idea. And I wondered why it was, and I don't know, like Berjayev, a couple weeks ago I had some formulation of my own answer to this. But it was around the time of the Iraq War, like Rod Dreher and those other people. I didn't even know who he was, but I must have smelt a rat around that because I was calling local AM radio, a local guy named Bob Lonsberry, and just saying like you're drinking the Kool-Aid, man. This war is going to be the worst thing ever, and I don't know where that came from. I don't know.
Well, actually, it was right around because I started teaching college, and my first semester, get this, was 2000, fall of 2001. And on the cover of the book I was using, I was teaching a composition class that they asked me to teach, which it had a picture of the Twin Towers on the cover. And two
Oh,
weeks into the semester, the the cover was now inaccurate historically,
Uh-huh.
right? It was now an artifact. But even back then, I would joke. Because I was a Waldorf teacher, and I would teach college at night, and I would come home after I was teaching college, and I'd tell my wife, "Just hide the kids in the basement. Civilization is coming to a standstill. It's over." Because I could see then, but it wasn't until I think everything was revealed with COVID, and all those
yeah,
institutions, they all, it's like, like the scene in The Wizard of Oz, pay no attention to the man behind the curtain.
Preparati emailed me one week in, just naming the whole plan, and I just recognized that as the truth.
Yeah.
He saw it because he knew things up in Canada. He knew things, and he's told me kind of what was going on. And so I was gifted that early, but I was already questioning. And Michael, you were right there. We gathered with you and Tara and Thomas, Jude, Germanari, and Guido for like a prototype podcast. We didn't know what we wanted to do, but we called ourselves the Hedge Group or Hedgerow,
The Hedge School. Yeah.
the Hedge School, and we're just going to try and figure things out online. But finding our rhythm, we just met twice. We didn't quite know what to do with it. Um,
Well, I think people were afraid to go public, right?
yeah, at that point, maybe there was some of that
yeah.
even in me.
There was some of that. That's what I remember. I never had that problem, which is why I don't have any friends. But Stephanie,
Yeah.
let's go back to this. So you're an architect, but you're also an artist.
Yes, yeah. One of the risks I think in architecture is that you get a little too disembodied because you're working on the computer and you're in meetings and stuff like that. And yeah, I've always kind of had a practice of art, and it's my way of kind of grasping things that I can't really put into words. And I usually go through cycles where I'll produce a bunch of artwork and then sit with it for, it depends what the cycle is. At the moment, it's maybe like a couple of year cycle where it's just, there's some works that I'm sitting with. And that I'll maybe then dive into philosophy or theology and try to understand what I was feeling and touching. But it kind of balances the kind of risks of being too disembodied in the architecture world. Because I do work on the computer, and there's definitely risks in that. I think there's ways around it. When I did my master's, I studied with a guy named Alberto Perez Gomez, who was a very interesting guy. He was a phenomenologist, one of the few really working.
Where was this again?
This is in Montreal at McGill University.
Okay.
And he retired really just a couple of years after I graduated. I mean, that's what I'm talking about. The whole thing kind of crumbling behind. It was that era was over. And he was really the last of his kind, at least at that school. So he was very suspicious of the computer and of that for these reasons that that knowledge comes through an embodied knowledge through an attunement. And so the art keeps me grounded, basically. And it kind of shows up, and there's ways of it, if you're totally inframed by the computer, a lot of it's that distance, between my pen and a paper. I mean, there's things that come through that I don't have full awareness of it. It comes through and it reveals itself to me. And that distance through the computer is possible. It's definitely possible, but it's much harder to kind of get through.
Did your hippie upbringing have, just before we moved on to did your hippie upbringing have much to do with that? Probably.
Definitely, yes.
How would you name that a little bit?
I remember when I was young, kind of the moment when I no longer had scabs and bloody knees. And the moment of feeling kind of like, oh, I'm kind of a little more separated. I'm a little more separated from the earth. And obviously, I grew up making, bows and arrows and, that kind of thing. Obviously, spending a lot of time in nature.
Nice feral childhood. I like that.
Yeah, me too.
And my first serious girlfriend actually was when I was, I met her traveling, and she was German. And so there was a part of that relationship where it was through Skype. And I was at architecture school in first year. And I remember being it was so strange. And it was kind of like that moment of not having bloody knees anymore, of just, I feel so much more disembodied and separate existing through this. And one of my first year projects was about making an architecture that would re-engage the body and re-engage presence.
Wow.
And yeah, so it was almost like there was some kind of seed from childhood of feeling connected. And I mean, there's a little more in there, but it's some things will take years to unpack.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I think,
it's really well said.
You mentioned McGill University, which architecturally is beautiful. I was there. Right. And
wasn't Arthur Fry there?
No, he was at the University of Toronto.
Right. Thank you.
But when I was there, not only does Montreal have McGill University, which is gorgeous, but beautiful Catholic churches.
Yeah, everywhere.
Right? Like Detroit is very similar in that way, though. Montreal is a much older, well, not really much older city, but it's definitely Detroit was a French Catholic city before it became an English city, before it became an American city.
De Pontiac, Cadillac.
Yeah. In fact, but here you go. My wife is actually, one of her ancestors was on the boat with Cadillac.
Really? Yeah. Wow.
Yeah. And he married an Indian. So that's, we got that going on. But the thing I'm trying to say is that, speaking of architecture, you think, I talk about this with my son a lot. lately. You know, there's something like you mentioned, the space. When you walk into one of those buildings, like even McGill, I'm sure, but he's certainly a Catholic, one of those Gothic revival Catholic churches. People just all of a sudden get quiet.
Yeah.
There's something in that space that compels silence or something, right? Or a feeling of reverence.
How do you separate that spirit of reverence from the thing that almost turns against itself, which we see in the church, like this kind of a ritualism for ritualism's sake and things? Because, you need a big organization. Well, not an organization. Maybe, again, it works in a different way. But the same energy that went to build some of these original Gothic cathedrals and things, or even places in Montreal, it seems to partake of some, at least in the Van Venn diagram, a lot of overlap with that institution that leads to this rigor mortis thing. Does that make sense, or somebody phrase it better?
I don't know where you're going.
I mean, definitely, I think in Quebec, I mean, it was so religious. It was like, I mean, it was pervasive. It was very,
Right.
And the church had a lot of political power.
Yeah. These things are wedded together, and like, how do we separate those things? The beauty from the technocratic and the kind of obsessed with power.
Well, I mean, if you think about it, I can't remember where I got this from. I mean, it's not just about power, but that's certainly part of it. But a civilization's biggest, most beautiful buildings indicate what the civilization values.
That's a great answer. Yeah.
Right. And so French Catholicism in Quebec, you see what the buildings they valued were, right? But then what are the buildings now that people value? Or what are the most biggest and beautiful buildings now?
Conference centers and
Thanks.
museums.
Yeah, conference centers.
That's another kind of congregation.
Let's talk about power.
Medical clinics and storage facilities. That's all I see. Storage. Most of Manhattan.
But they're not beautiful. Storage facilities are not beautiful. Or they're not trying to be beautiful or impressive.
Nor are these new medical clinics.
They're functional. But what's the buildings that are put up now that we're supposed to be impressed by?
We're supposed to be impressed with these glass monstrosities. They're really meant to intimidate us, but they have this kind of ersatz beauty that when we walk through the banking sector of New York, we feel like awe. Like I once felt awe in the presence of a Harrier jump jet. It was at one of these local air shows, and there it is. All this power came out and it went up. And there's a part of that makes one want to bow. And I think these things partake of each other's,
Well, and the other, or what would you say? Well, let's talk to the professional. Okay.
Yeah. This is why we had you on.
I think a lot of it has become, and like you said, the desire to, wow, that's really interesting. I mean, a lot of it is marketing. I mean, for like a lot of the condos, right? Like you get in design has become kind of a marketing feature for things that need to sell. But a lot of them are also still ways that people congregate, people come together, large sports stadiums and things like that. And those often have sculptural elements, like they're not entirely functional, just boxes. Right. They actually usually do put in some kind of cultural element, which is partakes a little bit of the marketing, but I think has something a little bit more going on as well to it. But this has happened before. In undergrad, we had this really great professor named Robert Jan van Pelt, and who's actually the world's kind of authority on Auschwitz. And this was one of the most important courses that they had in the program. And, kind of showed how the gas chambers had been designed by architects, right? Like somebody had to draw them, but also that the Nuremberg rallies were, big productions, and they were big architectural. It was a design. The whole thing was a design.
Yeah, you're getting at what interests me, sure.
And but a lot of it, partakes of those patterns of the divine. Like you look at some of the patterns for those Nuremberg rallies, right? Like if there's a center, there's a periphery, and a lot of it is kind of similar to the way that a church would be organized. Right. But the center is corrupted. So
Well, yeah, so
Yeah.
they appropriate religious, I wouldn't say
I'm still
imagery,
struggling with this.
but religious architecture, right? They appropriate that to create kind of a sense of the anti-sacred in a way.
yeah. Yeah, and I mean, it's funny that, I mean, ornament is something that kind of we're supposed to have stripped away with modernity, but we still have ornament. And then what we said, well, what is the function of that ornament today?
Mhm.
It's funny. There was a video. You guys know about Expo '67 that was in Montreal?
Yes,
I do not. I do not.
It was
the World Expo.
The World Expo.
Oh, okay. Oh,
And,
yeah. Yep.
you know, the United States had the Buckminster Fuller Pavilion, which is still there. All the plastic burnt off.
Sorry.
It was meant to be like a kind of enclosed, you know, it's a geodesic dome.
Yeah.
And yeah, it burned. There's incredible photos of the whole thing up in flames. I mean,
It's great.
It's really poetic. But the church had a pavilion at the expo.
Okay.
But it was not designed as a church. It was kind of a, you know, a kind of modernist, because there was a kind of right before the church kind of, you know, dived or, you know, crashed in popularity in Quebec. There was this kind of proliferation of really wild modernist churches in Montreal that you can still see. Anyway, so the Catholic Church had this pavilion that was, you know, very sculptural, very kind of modernist. But there was, if I'm not mistaken, there was no altar. And people, and there's an interview, and they asked the priest, well, where is Jesus in this building? And he responded, well, he's everywhere. And it's kind of one of those things where, well, if he's everywhere, then he's kind of nowhere.
Right.
You know, like, and so yeah.
But there's that Coventry Patmore maxim that I love so much, that the Eucharist was a meal, so that every meal might become a Eucharist. This idea, you know, that's why, like, I've suspected, and I think I've mentioned it on this podcast, that like there's probably something really subversive and Christian about clowns, because like we beat up the 70s clown mask. That's the central archetype of like when the church was at its worst. And I go, I don't know, like that much hatred directed at anything that particular. There must be something at its core quite good there, and I could be wrong, but I kind of hover around that question. And this architecture you're describing, I get it, we laugh at it, but the impulse is not that crazy, folks. It's not that crazy. I don't think.
No, I mean, if you go back to the Middle Ages and the early modern period, probably late Middle Ages, through England, I don't know through the French-speaking countries, but certainly in England and Ireland, there was carnival brought into the liturgy. Like, for instance, there was I can't remember which mass it was during the Christmas week, the week after Christmas. There was one thing they did where they had a boy bishop, right, for the Feast of the Holy Innocents. So, and it was kind of the you know, kind of a misrule figure, right? But they also had there was an asses mass, where
and where is this again?
This is in England.
Okay,
and I can't remember if it was Christmas.
Like
I'm in a Christmas, like the Shepherd's Mass or something. You know, that whole legend about on Christmas Eve that the animals could speak, right? And they still say this, you know, in some places, you know, if you go out to the barn on Christmas night, in the middle of the night, you'll hear the animals talk.
Yeah.
And what they would do at this asses means, they would actually put straw on the altar, and instead of saying amen, people would say "Ee-yaw." And it was kind of a topsy-turvy thing, but I shouldn't say it was irreverent, but it was carnivalesque, right? Which is kind of an interesting thing. And used to have those kinds of things in the church where you could get away with it. But I think what happened in the 70s, you know, just like, I mean,
that's very close to the Rabelaisian.
Well, the clown mass, and the other thing that is so poorly done is what do they call it? Liturgical dance, which just always looks embarrassing.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, if you
it's true, it's sad but true.
If you go to a Coptic liturgy, they do liturgical dance. You're like, I'm into this. Where they got the drums and they got this whole dancing thing going on, which is, and it doesn't seem stupid, right? But the liturgical dance that they would throw into the liturgy is like, what the hell? This is just so dumb, right?
Yeah,
It
there's
just
got no
doesn't
life
seem
in
to
it.
fit. It just
Yeah,
seems
yeah,
awkward,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
Like,
yeah.
like all of a sudden you're having, why don't we have the Friends mass, like the Friends television show? You know, they could do something dumb.
yeah.
Um, but I think it's interesting though that we're talking about these spaces. I mean, the thing is, you go into a church and and there have been lots of philosophizing and actually scientific examination of this, not only with the acoustics in one of those churches, but with the use of sacred geometry in them as
Yes.
well,
Yes.
which it just strikes the individual intuitively.
I'm
You don't know
cool with
why
all
you
that. Yeah,
feel
yeah.
Yeah.
this is beautiful and sacred, but you just feel like it is.
Yeah.
Just like when you see beautiful things in nature, sometimes you don't, wow, this is
Agreed.
shut up,
I like it.
right?
Yeah. You can get out your ruler and be like, okay, well, that's the golden ratio or whatever. But otherwise,
Yeah.
you're just like, this feels
You don't need to know
harmonious.
it's the golden ratio for it to
Yeah.
affect you, right?
Mhm.
Yeah. Definitely. But if you do know it, it kind of has another layer of effect, which is nice. You know,
Mhm.
you can pick it apart as well,
Mhm.
or you can just experience it. One of the things that I've has been a big part of kind of the research that I've done is really looking at how perception changed, especially with the development of perspective, because I think
You
that
read Illich on this, Stefan? He writes a lot on this too.
does he?
And
Okay.
he's kind of my world or something. But yeah, I mean, this is the real deal, right? Iconography, perspective, a lot of things about this for sure. Yeah.
Yeah, because I think it really changed a lot, and I think I mean, it frames us in so many ways because it really allowed for really the development of science, because you can have that objective perspective on things, that separated sense of being separate, which allows you to do photography, and so it's just saturated the entire culture.
It has.
This, and so I think when you get these let's say these cultural modes where it's all just becomes surface, where okay, there is this jokey weird dance because it's just become this awkward surface that we kind of shift around. And I think that that's kind of what architecture's become, because it doesn't have that inner life, because we've kind of gotten just so inframed in this outer vision. And so a lot of the research that I've been doing has been looking at, okay, well, what are the modes of perception that cause that closure? Like, what is it really? Because it has a shape, right? And this is the kind of the Blakean thing as well. If the imagination is structuring perception, then there will be a shape of that closure. And similarly, there'll be a shape of that openness, which can host the divine, which and whatnot. And you can see it in the development of perspective. I mean, the early, the people who use perspective, like Perugino, always equivocated the infinity point with Christ, or the center of the temple. So the infinity point, or the vanishing point, was the infinite. It wasn't just, okay, a vanishing point.
Right.
It wasn't just a finite point.
Right.
It was the infinite.
Yeah.
And if you kind of have enough capacity to use the imagination through vision, you can see it in these paintings that, oh my God, this is really an icon. But then you can see in the development afterwards how it closes up. And in some of the work that I've shown, kind of stuff in the 19th century, you can see that vanishing point. And there's a great painting by Béraud where there's now just a clock in front of the vanishing point. So
wow.
Clock time has covered up that sense of the infinite.
Wow, and it's all there, huh?
And then beyond that, you just lose even the sense of covering, because now it's just photography and whatnot, which has the sense of, has perceptive, but there's no sense of the infinite or the covering of the infinite. You're now just totally lost to it. And that structures and shapes these worldviews, kind of Marshall McLuhan, the medium is the massage. That's what sets up this capacity. And so yeah, so one of the ways that I've kind of been looking at trying to figure out, well, how did we reject these patterns, is trying to look into the past. And one person that I've gone to is Vitruvius. And Vitruvius is,
Okay.
of course, the kind of the classic, first century BC Roman, during a very secular age in Rome. I mean, that's when the Satyricon is written. But there is some things in Vitruvius that I think point some of the way for architects to kind of get out of.
Say more right away. Continue.
Well, the most recent research that I've done is looking at his sense of the four elements.
Okay. Loving this.
Because
check.
He's there's a description that he talks about timber. Of course, in Latin and Greek, timber is just means matter, stuff. But he's talking about real wood. And he's it's really practical stuff. He's saying, things like fir. Fir has a lot of air and fire, and you wouldn't use fir if you needed some fire resistance. If you needed fire resistance, you'd use oak, because oak's got a lot of water and earth.
Wow.
And the thing is, if you can, I mean, I've worked with these materials. Just behind me, there's some oak and there's some pine, and if you start to look at it, you can pull out from perception those characteristics in the timber. And what's interesting, it's a synthesis. Wow. So you can synthesize and hold there the sense of fire. Looking at the real, the real material, the real timber. Yeah. Not in an abstract conceptual thing, but really there, present. And you can hold that together in this synthesis. And I had a sense, okay, well, this has to go somewhere. And I had a sense that this has some relationship to logoi and to a sense of the divine in creation and to the burning bush and whatnot. And I was looking around and I was reading some St. Maximus and found really some theology there in St. Maximus that connects the elements, the synthesis of the elements, but it doesn't have that really embodied, working with timber kind of thing that Vitruvius gives. Yeah. Because it's about the virtues and it's abstract, but he has this synthesis, and he has this synthesis moving towards love, moving towards this union of all the elements.
So recommend a book for me and my listeners.
Vitruvius.
I shouldn't say my listeners, like our listeners, people who share my question. So say it again.
Vitruvius and St. Maximus, the Ambigua 21. Okay. Because and I think that in a way this is what Rothko was painting. Because Rothko,
I was thinking about Rothko the other day, our friend Stephen Clark, who's really brilliant. I was just thinking, trying to figure out things for myself. I've never laughed at Rothko, but I'm not very gifted in perception in that way. But I was just thinking the other day, and it was so funny you mentioned his name, that I'd like to do an episode with this guy, Stephen Clark, and say, describe Rothko to me, because obviously I'm the one who's not seeing it. People who I know see more than I do, love him. And so then the fault's with me, and I want to be kind of led in that direction. Take that wherever you want to take it, Stephane.
Yeah, it was very obscure for me as well until, I was doing this work and I got kind of tipped off a bit with what was going on with Rothko. And
I'm already excited.
Because the kind of the earth element or the water element is kind of, the darker, whereas the fire shines forward. You have a revelation and it's brightness and wind, air makes a kind of sound and there's movement. So there's in the dark and the water, there's stillness. And so in the Rothko paintings, you often have a dark patch. And that draws in vision. So it draws you into the visual plane, or you have an experience in your visual patterning of descending into the visual plane. Whereas the bright, usually then has like a kind of red or an orange above, has an experience of kind of coming out of the visual plane. So in a lot of Rothko, it's this synthesis of the descending into the visual plane and the kind of shining outwards.
Very cool.
Which is,
well, you just described Goethe's color theory.
Cool.
Which is
Yeah,
what
yeah.
that's Goethe's color theory.
Is it
that,
really?
Oh yeah,
Okay.
that blue draws us in, red comes out at us.
Yeah.
So how do
I
you,
was
and
aware of that.
actually
Yeah.
Interesting.
here's some arcane and abstruse stuff no one cares about. But in garden design, that's actually from Gertrude Jekyll,
Gertrude Jekyll.
Wow.
who was part of the Bloomsbury group.
Okay.
She
Chilling
wrote
there with Wolf and the others.
all those guys. And what happened with Gertrude Jekyll, she was a painter, but her eyes, I don't know if it was macular degeneration or whatever it was, but at least her eyes got to be really bad, so she couldn't paint. So she switched to designing gardens.
Oh,
And
wow.
she used that exact principle, where do we put the blue and white, and where do we put the red, and so that's big part
Wow.
of garden design is how you construct that scene
Interesting.
to act on the visitor, right? Even though the visitor might not know it, it's
I bet you it's all connected to synesthesia too, right? The music, the colors associated with music.
100, yeah, 100%.
one there.
Huh. Say more, Stephane.
Oh,
Wild. I didn't know anything about Rothko. Well, no, I vibe with it. That's all I can say.
I'm gonna look up Gertrude Jekyll for sure because I'm working on a garden at the moment, so that'll be really
There you go.
relevant.
It's one of the many services we provide. Regeneration podcast.
Well, you guys are a fount of references, and it's great. Yeah, synesthesia. Well, it's just that things are the senses are really interconnected. It's not some weird rare thing. I mean, I remember this guy I went to school with. He's like, "Oh, I'm synesthetic. I'm crazy. I'm a genius." It's like, dude, we're all synesthetic.
Yeah.
But
I like how I do this and move up. The sun is going down right over that way.
Oh yeah, you got a nice beam.
This is like a window that goes into a porch in which light.
So to become synesthetic would be exercises to help one become synesthetic. That's what I would call spirituality now, right?
Okay, I've got a good exercise.
Good.
Make 2 sandwiches.
Okay.
One sandwich you cut like straight. You just cut the rectangle at 90 degrees.
This is a great podcast, by the way. Go ahead.
The second sandwich you cut on an angle, the triangle.
Sure. And I would say it's the way your mom did it. You're drawn to it, don't you think? But no, I don't know.
Those are 2 different sandwiches. The experience of eating those 2 different sandwiches is different. And
one thing, actually, I used to always run this with my students. I got this. There's a documentary.
I've never thought of that. Never thought of that. Would have never thought of it. I never would have thought of it.
I'm gonna take it up a notch, Mike.
Okay, well,
there's a documentary called.
This is like our Halloween episode already, or something. Starting to get weird.
Canadian Thanksgiving.
Yeah.
There's this documentary called "Being in the World," which I used to show students in philosophy classes.
Oh yeah,
this is one of they interviewed a bunch of different people in there.
A lot of Steinerites, right?
No.
No, I thought I saw
not one. They interview a few philosophers. Charles Taylor, speaking of McGill University.
Good guy. Good guy.
He's in there for a minute or two.
Another good.
They talk to people who know how to do stuff, like a Japanese carpenter and a cook from New Orleans.
Yeah.
And one of the people they talk to is this flamenco singer and guitar player, and I can't remember his name, from Spain. And he's talking about this, and because the interviewer says, "Why do you play a guitar made by hand? Why can't you use one made by machine?" Because when you play, let's not talk about a guitar. Let's talk about a plate. Because when you take a plate made by machine, you have a plate made by clay that's been taken from the earth and molded by somebody's hands. The food on the handmade plate tastes different.
Yeah.
I can believe it.
It's true. And I would ask students if that's true or not, right? And the thing is,
would either of you two be willing to be blindfolded and take a bet, though? That like if they gave you to their best they could, like say just 2 chicken nuggets.
Michael, you
but that's not fair. Because it's all about the whole synesthesia.
You have to have all
the senses.
Yeah, fair. Good. No, see, I need this. Well said.
So here's another thing I used to do with the same class.
I needed to be schooled.
I would one time I just happened to have a piano in the classroom.
Mm-hmm.
I was like, this is cool. And I'm not a very good piano player or a very great singer, but I decided to do a demonstration with them, an experiment. I said, okay, I'm going to play this video of the Beatles doing Hey Jude. Let's play the first minute, right? And so I play it. Then I would play it on the piano and sing.
Mm.
And I would just ask them, how are they qualitatively different? And they would struggle, but basically they would say, I like it better when you do it. I said, well, why? Because I can feel it.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's a
You
great,
know,
great,
and the thing
great,
is, most of our diet of music is processed digitally, not even
Yes.
analog, right?
Yeah.
And so it's very different than you're sitting in a room with someone playing an instrument, or you're playing an instrument yourself. It's a very, very different
right,
experience.
right.
Yeah. I got very starved for that during COVID
Yeah.
because there was no live music or just listening to it in ear pods all the time. It was, yeah.
Wow.
And
Yeah.
we don't realize what it's doing to us.
Mhm.
Yeah.
And we'll put it this way, what is it doing to us?
I don't know.
Slowly changing us into bees, right?
No.
We need, what's that? I think, that gets at part of it because people need to know, like if we talk about the plan, we've had guests on recently where I'm remembering Gary Chartier just saying, like, what do you call it? Like when we all agree, even the three of us here today, we agree like something changed with like COVID. And our friend Greta would say, something changed with 9/11, man. And
Yep.
then, if Michael's not doing it, I'm doing it. I'm saying, how would you describe that thing? Do you want to call it permanent Washington? Do you call it the World Economic Forum? What? And this interests me. And I'm thinking the same distinction could be applied.
Yeah.
Or I would say that maybe you could say what we experienced through COVID and
Yeah.
through, I mean, I was teaching during COVID. Remember, we've talked
Yeah.
about more teaching in masks is an experience,
Right.
or teaching online,
Oh my God.
which I mean, it can be okay, but it's not the same thing as being in person, right?
Right.
But in a way that you could say that COVID normalized it to a degree we don't even realize.
Mhm.
Normalized being online. And now I'm not young, but I have kids who are young, right? And especially, I talk to some of them, and the ones who I have, most of them aren't married. You talk to them about dating. It's not like when we were kids, Mike. There's no
No,
place
right,
to
right,
meet
right,
anybody.
right, yeah.
People, they meet people online,
Right.
and they meet
Yeah.
an avatar of a person online,
Mhm.
which is and but the thing is, COVID normalized all that as well.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of it is efficiency. It's it'd be very, it'd take a lot of energy to come and meet you guys in person.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm thankful for it, right? I'm thankful we can do this.
Yeah.
But
How do we
there are
make
other
people
areas
hungry
of our
for the
lives.
real? How do we, that's one way of, I was saying how, making
Well,
these distinctions is kind of a cultivate. Keep going. Yeah.
go back to my question. So why is it we don't notice that with music?
Yeah.
I mean, I think that we don't really know that we live in and through our imagination. That even auditorily, the way that one of the examples that I often give if I do give a talk is like, take like 4 points, for example, like making a square, and then with your eyes pull out 3, and you've got a triangle. And now push your perception back so you're just seeing the 4. So you can do this push and pull in perception, pull out one thing and push back one thing. And it kind of shows you, okay, my imagination is working in and through my perception. Now that's visual perception, but you can do that auditorily. And I think that one aspect is that, yeah, we don't live really as much in and through the imagination.
Yeah.
People don't read as many books, and it's those gaps, it's those little, where you need to fill things in. And I think that's in a live performance, I think that's happening, right? Because you have that continuity. It's infinite, right? Like you can't break it down. You can't what's the calculus term? Differentiate, right? Like it's undifferentiated because it's continuous. So to make it digital, you've got to slice it into those little things and make it finite. And but yeah, I think the imagination is kind of working to kind of understand and piece together that continuity.
Right.
And so yeah, it's not working basically.
We've become accustomed.
I love it.
We've become accustomed to utilitarianism, right?
Yeah.
So a college classroom is a great example. So when I was a Waldorf teacher, I had my classroom, and it was all vibe, right? It was, there was a whole vibe that was with it. And different kinds of pictures on the walls.
I love it.
I usually had some kind of Persian rug or something at the front of the classroom.
I wish I was there right now.
When I was a professor.
I wish we were podcasting from there.
Yeah.
All three of us.
Well, it's like my house. Actually, my house is basically a Waldorf classroom. But then when I was a professor, and I don't care where I was teaching, the classrooms all had just functional, materials and functional chairs and functional tables, and it had no vibe at all. So the one place I was teaching, Adrian College, where after Mary Grove closed, I was teaching there a little bit part-time. And my sister went there in the 80s. And I remember one time stopping in the middle of class, and we go, you know what, guys? I think this is the same junk that was on the walls when my sister came here in 1981.
Yeah.
I've
always viscerally hated it and shied away from it.
Right? Cinder block,
I know. I've never thought about it because my body has always taken me away from it. Like I never went to class.
And
my own kids, I never cared if they went to school.
And Mike,
but I've just
who was
never
on top of this?
Yeah, they all look like prisons to me. They feel like prisons.
do.
Yeah.
My elementary school looked like a jail. But you know who was on top of this over 100 years ago?
James Conant.
Rudolf Steiner.
Oh yeah.
Oh, I think I'm talking about the bad guy. You're talking about the good guy.
Yeah. No, he was.
I don't think they ever knew of each other.
Yeah, William Morris.
Yeah. Sure.
No, I think that
Steiner would say that with a doorway, for instance, because they're all usually,
rectangular,
uniform, and he would say, no, we don't know by looking at a door which way it's supposed to open. You have to look for the handle.
Right.
And so he thought there should be angles or not angles, or curves.
Oh, that was his idea with that. Interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting. Huh.
Wow.
I didn't know that was his idea with the doors. That's really fascinating.
Well, he's just one of those guys. They just know stuff.
Yeah.
And he's not a trained architect, and he designed the buildings. He does. If you look up the first Goetheanum.
Yeah, the one in wood and.
Yeah, which is an amazing structure.
Yeah.
Made by a non-professional, right?
Well, this is one of the things I've really kind of let go a lot of the professional path, because it stifles and it kills a lot of the creativity, and you kind of just at a certain point need to say, well, are you going to choose the
life or death?
Yeah, life or death kind of thing.
Yeah, really.
But I think vibe needs to be raised as one of the highest, philosophical concepts. Vibe, and the German is Stimmung, which comes from Stimme, which is the voice. So it's the voice that's
it's a sign of hope in the States, at least in my circles, that most young people are very cool with that. It's used well in their vocabulary, and they're trying to attune themselves to it.
Yeah.
So tell us, who are your heroes? Teach us a little bit about architecture. Who should we read? Who's really just brought you to life intellectually? You're a wild conversationalist, and your backstory is very interesting. Say more about you. What gets you? What do you think people need to be reading at this time and thinking?
I think okay, architecturally, I do think that my
Right.
thesis advisor is somebody
Yeah.
worth reading because it's pretty it's very good history as well. You
Yeah.
want to learn like the history of yeah, perspective and representation in architecture.
And what's his name?
Alberto Perez Gomez.
Okay. Yeah.
And the book I'd recommend is Attunement. That's the title.
Okay.
Um, and otherwise, I mean, I don't know.
Okay.
I'm kind of all over the place. But I mean, Blake is
Yeah. Right.
Blake is great. Northrop Frye.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Marshall McLuhan is talking about this. Marshall McLuhan was very influenced by Siegfried Gideon, who
Okay.
wrote a book called Space, Time, and Architecture,
Hmm.
which reads a bit like a kind of classic architectural history book, but it's really about these shiftings in modes of perception,
Yeah.
and then how that's reflected in the built environment, and that influenced Marshall McLuhan a lot. And that way of thinking you find in Gene Gebser, as
Okay.
well as Oswald Spengler.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And it's really the kind of, I think, the same
We haven't mentioned
worldview.
Gebser, nor have I read him at all. Describe him to people. I've mentioned Spengler a fair amount.
Yeah, I definitely am not an expert on it,
Okay.
but really, he sees the kind of the pre-perspectival mode,
Okay.
which someone like, I don't know if you know Robert Smithson, the American land artist from the later half of the 20th century,
Okay.
who was noticed this with visual perception as well. And he'd gone to the Yucatan, he'd gone to Mexico, noticed that indigenous people had much more kind of peripheral ways of seeing, peripheral modes of vision.
Yeah.
And then the modern was very much object on ground. And he was kind of looking more for this bit where the object is there, but there's a little more fluidity in terms
Yeah.
of
Yeah.
the background. And Gebsner kind of calls that, the pre-perspectival, the perspectival, and then the next stage he calls, the aperspectival, which, yeah. Anyway, so
Worth reading. Yeah.
yeah, definitely worth reading.
Because there's a pattern, like for me, an archetypal pattern. There's a guy, I think a psychologist. His name could be Tibor Machin. I'd have to look it up, but he would call cotension and ditension. Have you heard of that distinction? Cotension, which people, a lot of historians, you mentioned Spengler, but I'm thinking of like Burckhardt and others, might say that kind of primitive consciousness and open. We're noticing a lot, more right-brained. And that ditension, is that kind of focused scientific outness. It creates outness for Coleridge and so forth. And I see kind of an analog there, that when you said Gebser posits a third, the infant is coming from pure cotention, right? A generalized awareness, picking things out. And with adolescence, we tend to dial in. And then if ontogeny is recapitulating phylogeny, if the Steinerist, macro history mirrors from sperm to worm, the birth of each individual, then we're positing, as well as human intelligence, where is it going now? From cotension to ditension. And then for Rudolf Steiner, which he would call final participation, is this third symphonic movement, where a cotension and ditension at the same time, one in many at the same time. Original participation, alienation, merged together in a higher orchestral piece.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes.
And what Steiner was talking about, I mean, in his aesthetic works and his theories about everything really, but architecture, is that the things we use, what they're made of and what they look like, make a big difference spiritually.
Yeah.
It can either be deadening or enlivening or neutral, but that's, I mean, how do we, and I think if you look, I mean, I know about this much about the history of architecture, and it's all in the 12th century, with the rise of Gothic architecture, which also was accompanied by the Divine Feminine, this praying of the Rosary, Saint Francis of Assisi, right? This whole, paradigm shift almost in the Christian thinking from Romanesque architecture to Gothic architecture. Let the light in, right? Abbot Suger.
Yes, yes.
But the thing is, here's the question. We mentioned earlier that that a culture's most impressive buildings represent the things that are important to them. But there's not only that, it's also that the materials we surround ourselves in, and the shapes, the images, they have a spiritual influence on us, and vice
Sure.
versa. And and
That's the city of God. That's
well,
Revelation.
no, but the thing is, if we don't take that into consideration, like I'm really lucky to be in this house, which was built in the 1860s, and has wood every place, and most of it was built, or it was all timbered by the person who built the house, and his cousin ran the lumber yard, right? Who lived around the corner. So the
This
wood
is
that
a
was
3x10 milled, not
well,
a mile from here.
the wood
my
that was
house,
used
yeah.
to build my house grew here 150 years ago.
Mm.
But the thing is, when we come into these kinds of spaces that are functional and artificial, they're spiritually deadening, right? That's Steiner's position. So, and what he was saying, we can't go backwards, but we have to go forwards into how do we create spaces that feel enlivening, right? And it's not just the spaces, but it's everything else too. It's like on my house, for instance, a lot of the hinges have beautiful scroll work on the hinge on the inside of the door, which no one looks at, right? People who go, what am I going to waste time doing that for? I have. But even some of the doorknobs have great scroll
Yeah,
work
right.
on them. And because why? Because beauty matters. That's why.
Yeah. Yeah. And some of it's tricky. I mean, I think that the way we build, I mean, it's not really architects. That's just how we build. There's a kind of like there's a folk aspect to it too.
Yeah.
Even how we build as modernists today. I mean, if I want to build something with Corinthian capitals and everything like that, I got to go find somebody really obscure. Like, just the way people build. And this is like Gideon's thing. It's like that's the worldview kind of expressing itself in steel studs and drywall at the moment. I don't, there are some things honestly with modernity that I like. I mean, I was in an apartment before this that was a small 3.5.
One of our listeners, John McCormick, he's eating this up because he's a drywaller. He's a brilliant guy. We'll have him on the podcast. Totally brilliant.
Oh,
he's
yeah?
a drywaller, but sees everything. He sees the poetry. You guys would hit it off.
Oh,
I'll have to introduce you to. Yeah.
Drywallers, they're hardworking people.
Yeah. But again, he calls it soul deadening. And he can extrapolate from drywall to all the evils of the world. In a way, I exaggerated a little bit.
It all begins here.
Yeah.
Gypsum.
The type of space he's paid to create, the money system, the motives behind it, what we call housing. Things.
Yeah. But there is also something kind of freshening too about a kind of an open, glazed space. I mean, there is. I don't know. I'm not so. I mean, definitely there's a lot of soul deadening things going along. I'm not willing to say that it's all soul deadening.
Yeah, right.
No.
But yeah.
Yeah, I always tell him like he's not going to starve.
But
he's got
I
a
would
skill.
say, so
be...
so here's what I'll throw out there, right? My house was built by farmers, right? I think they were prosperous farmers, but they were farmers, right? They were people who worked 90-hour weeks. And so that space was built by common people. And I would say that the spaces you're talking about, the nicer ones, and I've seen some extraordinarily beautiful homes built. A friend of ours who lives a few miles away, they're loaded. They built this beautiful, beautiful house, and it's spacious, and it's got all kinds of character to it, right? Modern materials. But that was, and this is what William Morris was on about. He goes, the thing is, we need this not just for the wealthy. We need these kinds of beautiful spaces for common people.
Yeah. I mean, I think one aspect is these are the materials that you can get the other thing is that there's a lot of restrictions now about building your own home.
Yeah.
And I mean, at least where I'm from in British Columbia, you can't build your own home anymore.
No. That's something you could go down a wormhole, a rabbit hole with that, right? Because again,
You
it's
can
so
here.
yeah.
You
My
can now?
neighbor built his
Okay.
house.
Yeah.
Yeah, you can, but you have to get some certification and yada, yada, yada. I mean, it should be a human right. And
Yeah.
I mean, my mother, she built a house herself illegally because, you know, she wasn't going to be able to do it legally.
Mhm.
And, you know, she did it for a fraction of the cost.
Yeah.
Because that's how hippies roll. People.
That's how it is, really. You just do it. And
But I want to. Oh, go ahead. Finish.
oh,
Yeah.
but just that, you know, that's yeah, it's harder to access that knowledge and to do it yourself.
Yeah. I was gonna put kind of the discussion of like housing as a verb and housing as a noun, kind of on that same framework in meta history, that like for many years when we as a species were involved in like original participation, kind of a oneness, but we hadn't yet, you know, crusted out for the individual, which is later to rejoin like a seed. But you know, housing was a verb. My hero Ivan Illich, you know, he's always tracking how like population was a verb, then it became a noun, like Caesar counts the people. But housing was a verb. It's what we were doing, what your parents were doing when they were throwing something up for you to sleep in, right?
Yeah.
They were involved, then it becomes a noun, then it's quantified and all left-brained and everything. And you know, I wonder if there's an impetus in our time because the times are so dark in terms of, you know, on the cusp of literally everything being counted and numbered, you know, Mike's farm animals and things, whether there's a countervailing movement. You know, for Steiner, the movement in St. Michael in our time is we got to keep moving in this direction. Nobody's going to save it for you. But is there something where with space again, we're supposed to be in the political realm, in the cultural realm, in the spiritual realm, you know, advocating for that movement back to kind of housing as a verb, but also I'm sure there's something redeemable about housing as a noun, something like that, you know.
Yeah, I mean, I think at least for architects, I can speak for architects, it's being more involved and on site. I mean, you know, I've worked in a lot of different offices, and that's that same detachment where you're there, you're stuck in the office behind your computer.
Yeah.
The architects, they don't even have much of a relationship with the clients. And I think that's in terms of another noun or verb-based kind of notion, it's having a relationship.
Yeah. Okay.
Whereas I think they're not going to the site. They don't have a relationship with the land, and they don't have a relationship with the person.
Do most of them care? Do you think they once cared and kind of lost the care because they were making money and they had to, you know, pay for their kids' soccer team or something?
I think there's definitely a spectrum. There's lots of people who care about something. I mean, because architecture is not a very lucrative business. It can be a lucrative business, you know, if you build a big office and whatnot, but you know, largely it's not. It's because people care about architecture. But then the question is, well, what is their architecture that they care so much about? And I've been in a lot of offices like that where it's like, okay, you just need therapy, you know, like, you don't need more architecture. You just need to talk to somebody.
Right. Well, actually, you know, Stephane, you remind me of
that's really funny.
Of a guy I trained as a teacher. I was actually his son's teacher. Then he was an architect and he wanted to be a Waldorf teacher. And he was the best guy. And he was also extraordinary, like you, artistically talented, which is what brought him into architecture. And, you know, and he had an artistic sense of seeing things. And actually, one of the things he told me, because with that class, we went on our class trip to Toronto in Canada. And he was explaining to me what's so cool about the architecture in Toronto. Because in Toronto, they didn't flatten all the old stuff. They incorporated the new and the old together.
Right.
Which is kind of, it wasn't really, if you know, I don't think Montreal is not like that, but certainly that I know of. But Toronto, what's impressive, and at least it used to be in downtown Toronto, is that you would have these old churches or school buildings.
Were they integrated well?
Not just integrated, but they added the modern onto it.
Oh, I see.
But it didn't look stupid, right? He told me, he said, this is like the archetype of what to do with architecture in all the courses you take. Is that what you found? Did they tell you that too? Now he's older than I am, so he's a lot older than you.
Um, I like it when they do that. I mean, I know people are like, oh, it's facadism. They'll leave the facade and whatnot, and then just build behind it. But I like it. I think it's like a kind of like a Roman, what do they call it, like a palimpsest? You know, the old
Yeah.
walls in
Yeah,
Rome
yeah,
where you
yeah,
got
yeah.
little bits and pieces. It's like a collage. I like that.
It certainly doesn't offend me at all.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I think in Toronto, the one thing that they've got is some really crazy zoning, where you'll have 2-story houses and then a 60-story condo tower,
Yeah.
and it's like that. What, with no parking for the condo tower?
With no parking, right?
For like with like 6 bike racks or something.
So we're getting along. So before we end, you said you had a thing you
We'll
wanted
have to
to
have you back on, Stephane. What's that, Michael?
ask. Stephane, you said you had things you wanted to ask us
Well, I mean, I feel like
or pick our brains about something.
yeah, well, I assumed it would kind of, happen through the conversation. The stuff with Steiner, and I know, well, I've got my notepad here. I'm going to look up Gertrude Jekyll.
Yeah, Gertrude Jekyll.
And so, yeah, definitely would want to, know more about that. And also with Steiner, I've read a bit of Steiner, dipped in a bit, and his stuff. What is this? He's got there's a collection. I think I've got it here that kind of put together his architectural stuff. I feel like what you said today about the door, I was like, oh, that's really interesting.
Yeah, I'd never heard you say that, Michael. I found it very interesting.
Oh,
What
cool.
else? You say something else like that about Steiner.
Yeah.
Well, there are a lot of things, because not only that
I like it when you say cool
and it's
things
like
about
poetry,
Steiner.
right? It's like poetry. I always tell, like in a creative writing class, I'll tell students, form has to fit function, right? You have to have, if you want to, whatever the meaning of you're trying to convey, you have to have the right body for it to inhabit. But the other part, which is not architectural, what I think it does apply, because it applies to modernity, and the imagination. One of the things Steiner was big on was that, don't give children things that are finished, because then their imagination has no place to go. So he would just say, don't give a girl a doll that pees and cries and talks and opens her eyes. Give her a rag doll with just a couple dots for eyes and maybe a smile, because that way you let the child's imagination do the rest.
Right.
And I saw that happen with my own kids. My daughter May, who's almost 28, when she was little, she made a doll out of a corn cob.
Wow.
She wrapped it. She found a piece of silk cloth, and she treated that like the most precious thing in the world. But it was her imagination doing all the work.
Yeah.
Right.
My friends, or one of my friends and I, we always have this running joke where we'll see a building under construction and it'll just be the studs and the plywood and whatever, and we'll be like, oh, it's perfect right there. Just
don't ruin it.
Don't do anything else. That's it.
I hadn't heard that one. That's great.
But that's really interesting. Do you think Steiner kind of had that work that way, to kind of leave gaps in his architecture for the imagination to enter into?
Yes, and you can see a lot. You see in Steiner's architecture, you don't see any sharp corners.
Right.
It's all because you got to let the energy flow, right? And not the energy of the room, but also the psychic energy of the person looking at it, right? Or inhabiting it, right?
Conversely, John Calper-Powys walking through New York, these glass buildings, he was the most visceral man I've ever read, but the horror he felt in the presence of the opposite of Steiner, just steel and glass with right angles. He chronicles what it does to the human body, things like that. Jung did as well, right? In a famous essay when he arrived in the States, he just saw like our whole history just laid out before him when he saw these buildings in New York City. He just knew the animating spirit and like which direction we were heading.
Well, we talked about that before, Mike, right? With the United States and Canada are not old civilizations.
No.
My house is 150 years, 160 years old. You tell somebody that, wow, our house is old. Tell somebody in England, they're like, wow, so it was just built, right? like Olivia Cheney, for instance, her house, I think it's gotta be 400 years old,
Yeah.
right? So we have, and I think in the New World we have layers. So you have the native layer, right?
Yeah.
Then you have here in Michigan, you have the French layer. Then you have the English layer, and it's still in the American layer. And the modern layer it's not very deep,
No, and
right?
I think one of the things with the modern layers is it rarely kind of connects down through the other layers.
Yeah.
And I think
Right.
anything moving forward, any construction or whatever, if it can pick into those layers that are present, like they're there in the built environment, but also just in the stories that are
Right.
there, there's stuff to work with. And I think one of the myths of the modern is that there's nothing to work with.
Right.
And then postmodernity is just like, well, we work with things, but we just use them superficially in terms
Well,
of
yeah,
architecture.
And I think there's also
That's your
an element-
vanishing point thing again, right? It's another way of telling the story that like we've lost the vanishing point.
Well, tell me if I'm wrong, but I think there's also an element in, well, not just modern architecture, some aspects of it, but modern culture in general, that it's kind of a throwaway thing, right? It's not we're not planning on this being here in 100 years.
Right.
Like even a thing as huge as a mall or a
To give
sports
credit
center,
where credit is due,
it's
Pope
not gonna be
Francis
there
is
100
saying that
years.
all the time, right?
Do you think a shopping mall is going to be there in 100 years, Mike?
No, right. No, I'm
No.
saying Pope Francis is saying this all the time, and it's very useful in his published writings. Throwaway culture.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I worked in designing restaurants for a long time, and it's like, their dirty secret, which one designer said on radio one time. Yeah, that's kind of around for 5 years.
Yeah.
And,
Wow.
and then it's all getting thrown out, and then there's a revamp.
Which is crazy, right?
Yeah.
Crazy.
So you guys would have liked this. So when I was in Olympia, Washington last month to give a lecture, the last night we went out to dinner into this restaurant bar that's been in the same spot since 1935.
Wow.
So
Long
it
in
was
today's
nice. I
standards, yeah.
don't remember I've ever been in a place that old that was still serving, like, and it still looked like it was built in 1935. It's kind of fun. And it was nice. It was nice.
Well, some of those places, like, it would be death to the restaurant if they ever did renovate.
Yeah.
It would lose the whole character, and yeah.
Yeah, we don't.
What do you see? What do you see from your position north of the St. Lawrence on American electoral politics in the next month or so? And you can punt, and punting isn't punting. Punting is say uninterested.
And then I'll do Trudeau.
Oh my God.
Oh man! Warning. Listening to Michael Martin on Trudeau is going to be
No, don't even
offensive to
get me
kids'
going.
ears under. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah. No, we've got it pretty bad too. It's
Yeah. You said you had wake up moments during the truckers stuff.
Yeah. I mean, when COVID happened, I mean, I was like, oh, great. This is like I had my art studio and I had 3 months off work. I'm like, this is like I just got an artist grant. I'm going to go in my art studio and I'm going to work away. And then the vaccines came out, and then I was like, okay, now I need to make a decision here and figure out what the hell is going on. And then it was like, oh my God.
Right.
And then the thing that was really eye-opening about the trucker thing and going there and seeing it on two weekends was just how different.
Yeah, propaganda, regimes of propaganda.
It was insane, because I was the second time I went, I was in Ottawa, and I had the radio on for, Ottawa radio, and I was hearing like I'm literally, maybe a kilometer away, roughly a mile.
Yeah.
And they're describing, what's going on. And I'm like, okay. And then I go there, and it was just so shocking, because I was like, I was a kilometer away, and what they were describing, and now I'm here, and it's just not the same thing. It's not the same reality.
I mean,
TV right now in the States is so crazy, isn't it, Michael?
everything.
Yesterday, they have the tragedy, a real tragedy of a massive hurricane ripping through the state of Florida. But a worse tragedy was vice presidential, but also like it was Kamala out there, she had a lot of photo ops telling people like, there's a hurricane out there and it's really dangerous. So you're going to have to evacuate, and people were like, wow, she had advisors tell her this is going to be good. It's a unifying message, like the layers of complexity that went into that vacuous weird act that, how can not everybody be throwing up? Go ahead, Michael. Yeah, I don't know.
Well, and I think that's one of one of the things I learned going through the COVID thing is, well, I learned, but I already knew about it, but it became much more evident about propaganda, right? And actually, at the time that the truckers thing was going on, I had some students. I was teaching at the college still. I had some students from Canada, and they were terrified.
About
They were from
truckers.
Canada. They were Canadian students.
But what
They were
were they
terrified
afraid
about
of?
what was
that
going
your
on back
country
home.
that your country was being taken over by rednecks.
Well,
Oh.
yeah, no, they weren't terrified about. They were
No.
terrified about Trudeau,
Oh yeah, he froze the
and
bank
when
accounts.
he was debanking people,
Yeah.
right?
I was so
for
the opposite.
donating $20 to the protest,
Right.
Yeah.
and they would get their bank accounts frozen, and these kids were scared.
That
I
was
said,
just
a couple of them, I said, if it gets really weird by the,
It all really
it's
happened.
still weird by the end
All
of the
this stuff
semester,
happened.
you can stay at my house till it blows over.
Yeah, I can't believe people don't admit that these things happen. They're happening in real time. Just like
Yeah.
Guido said last week, that like we were disagreeing whether these people that they're throwing up for office, like Trump and Kamala, or even like Gavin Newsom or Pete Buttigieg and so forth, that like it shows the system is so weak. And our guest said, no, it shows the system is so strong. They can laugh at you now, I don't know what to make of any of that.
Well, all I'm worried about is like Stephane just said, with the movie
trucker thing was so
version and the
obvious.
real version.
Yeah, but it's so obvious. You would think.
Yeah.
Well, I think to a lot of people it's become more obvious over time.
January 6th here. It's another one.
But you have the movie version or the media version of protest, and you have the actual people who were there. I said, no, it was fun. It was a party.
Yeah.
It was a party.
It was a love fest, right?
Well, at the beginning it was a party. It wasn't a party at the end.
Okay.
But,
what was the mood at the end? Just people are cold and hungry and kind of bitter.
a lot of the main organizers had left, and so there was kind of a lot of kind of people just hanging along, and then militarized police were in kind of clearing the area, and there was just a lot more people.
It got ugly.
It got ugly. But I mean, the big thing was it was all, these are just a bunch of white redneck truckers.
Yeah.
And that's just not the case. A lot of Sikh Canadians are truckers. And, the Sikh flag was like right at the front of the line in front of the police.
Yep.
And there's people there from China and from Eastern Europe. And they often said the same thing. They were like, I left my country to avoid this.
Yeah.
And they're like, regular Canadians don't realize what this is. We know what this is. We've seen it.
Yeah.
And so, and I think that's, largely what they didn't want getting out there.
Yeah. I love this one.
It's that dark.
This one Sikh trucker I saw in there goes, I'm just enjoying the vibe. Everybody's and but let me ask you this, because
he said vibe.
Right now, I get the news, and I'm my grandfather was Canadian, so I'm kind of, and I live very close to Canada. So I'm acutely aware of what's going on in Canada, but I only know what's going on through social media or the national news, which never comes up. What's the vibe there now?
What's going
on? The vibe is I mean, it's, at one level, it's just kind of crazy how life just carries on, right?
And Quebec was in particular crazy during that part, which which surprised me.
Yeah, we had lockdowns, we had
it was severe too, right?
It was severe, and some of it was kind of cruel and unusual punishment. Bringing in a 10 p.m. curfew right before New Year's Eve. Honestly, it's the middle of winter. Besides New Year's Eve, most people are not out past 10 p.m. walking around outside. Well, I guess you're going to the bars and stuff, but no, but people moved on. There is definitely a sense that, people are like, oh, we wouldn't accept it again, but I don't know. And, we've got some political shiftings. I mean, basically the Liberals are just only being propped up by first the NDP and now the Bloc Québécois. They're basically dead, but just being propped up by other parties. or just trying to milk them for whatever they can get them
Yeah.
for. And Canada, we usually do one party. We'll do the Conservatives for 9 years, and then we'll do the Liberals for 9 years, and then we'll go back. So,
Do you think Justin's cooked?
oh, he's dead in the water. He won't have a political career after this. I think he's so far gone. The support in his party's gone.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, it's really just being propped up. I mean, there could be an election tomorrow if they stopped propping him up, but they'll probably hold on and milk that party for whatever they can, which is now Quebec. Quebec is now milking the Liberals, and it'll continue probably till October of next year.
Really,
You're
that
very
long.
very astute on Canadian politics. Yeah.
Well, it
just shows how little I know about Canadian politics.
Well, how little we're told, right?
Yeah, right.
Yeah, well, now in Canada, I haven't looked too much into it, but like we don't get news on social media now.
What?
Oh, that's
it's like
right.
Canadian news. It's Canadian news. I don't know all the details of the ban, but sometimes I'll go to a Canadian news site on Instagram or something, and it's like you can't access this in your country or something like that.
Well,
yeah, I mean, we'll obviously be still.
Hopefully, they'll allow this podcast to
go. Can you direct people to any of your work or anything, Stephane?
Yeah, I have a website, stephanegaulin-brown.com.
I'll link to it in the comment section.
Great. Yeah, I've got an email there, and you can also see projects and artwork, and also there's a link there to my research, my academia edu.
Yeah.
And
awesome.
You're a fascinating person. So we're saying it right now. You're coming back on again. Yeah. Thanks.
I'd love it. It's a dream come true to be on the podcast.
That's a real honor. Thank you so much, Stephane. Thank you for joining everybody for the Regeneration Podcast. We'll see you again next week.